Welcome back again to Rinka's Kitchen. What I'd like to do is share a family favorite recipe, which is called tomato cabbage. Paradicsomos kāposta. Kāposta means cabbage and paradicsomos means tomato. So what I'd like to do is begin by telling you all the ingredients that I'm using in this recipe. So what I've done is I've used 1 medium head of cabbage. So I've already diced it up into small bite-sized pieces. So, and I've added most of it into a stock pot. I would recommend that you use a stock pot because there's a lot of cabbage in this, and then eventually what happens to the cabbage, it kind of shrinks. But it's really good to have a large pot when you're cooking this recipe. So what I've done is I put the majority of it in there, and now I'm going to add the remainder of it into the pot. So it's going to fill up pretty much right up to the top. And this is was a family favorite of my mom's. This was actually something that my mom had to cook up for me at least once a month because it's actually one of my favorite recipes. And I like it because it can be served with meat, it can be served with rice, it can be served with mashed potatoes, or you can eat it on its own. And I would take this to work. Actually, this is great to freeze it into small freezer containers, and you can take it and pop it into the microwave, and I would just eat that for lunch. And it's really nice on a cold winter's day. It's sort of like comfort food. So but then you can add other things to it, like you can eat it with fish, or you can eat it with pork. In my recipe on the website, it says that variation is that you can add cooked pork or beef. And today my husband and I are going to have it with beef. So after the show, we're going to have this recipe with some beef stew recipe that I've frozen down. So I'm going to add it to this great recipe. So the next step would be to add tomatoes. So I've cut them up into quarter-sized pieces. So I'm going to add that into with the cabbage. And then I'm going to stir that around in there. And it doesn't matter if the tomatoes stay at the top, because eventually what happens is that it's going to kind of mix in with the liquid as it's cooking. And then I'm going to add my onions. So this is 1 medium sweet onion. And if you like a lot of onions, you can add more onions, and you can add more potatoes if you like. I'm just going to mix that around at the top. Not to worry that it's not coming down going to the bottom, because eventually when you add the liquid, it's going to start boiling and it's going to start mixing around in there. So, and then I've got some garlic cloves. And you can add as many garlic cloves as you want. I've got about 3 cloves of garlic here. I'm just going to mix that up at the top. And I use a large stock pot. It just gives it more room for it to cook. And then what I do is I add my water. So I've got 1.5 cups of water. And then I've got 1 liter of tomato juice. So I've bought some canned tomato juice. So I'm going to pour this onto the cabbage and the tomatoes and the onions and garlic. So it's just going to kind of soak in there. And then stir it around a little bit. It's just going to kind of cook slowly in this, and I would put it at medium heat and cook it for about 45 minutes. And then I've got all my spices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add ketchup. So I've got about, according to my recipe, I've got about 4 tablespoons of ketchup, just for a little bit of flavor. Now traditionally, the Hungarian recipe doesn't call for ketchup, but I've added a little bit for flavor. And then I've got some brown sugar. So I've got a teaspoon of brown sugar, just to give it a little bit, take that sour edge off of the recipe. And then I've got some herbal, sort of like a vegetable base. that I bought. So whatever you have at home, any herbal or vegetable base. So I'm going to add that into my recipe. And I'm going to put the heat on for about, start it off at about medium heat. And this is going to cook for about 45 minutes. So I've got some ground pepper. I've got 1 teaspoon of ground pepper. I like to add a lot of black ground pepper. And then I've got some sea salt. So I've got about a teaspoon of sea salt. And I mix that around. And it's going to cook there slowly for about 45 minutes. And I'm going to put the lid on the stock pot. And of course, the cabbage has water in it too, so it looks a bit dry right now, but as it is cooking slowly in the tomato juice and that, it's going to become a lot more watery, and it's going to have kind of like a watery base to it. So it's not going to be soup. It's going to be like soup. It's going to be more vegetable, and then there's going to be some juices. A very, very tasty recipe, and when I come back, I'm going to show you what the finished product is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tablespoon of a quarter cup of flour, and then I'm going to brown it in some vegetable shortening, and then I'm going to add that paste to the juices. Once you'll see that there's going to be a lot more juices in this recipe, and what it does is it thickens the sauce. So I'll be back and I'll be showing you what this great recipe looks like. Welcome back again to Irinka's Kitchen. I have a tomato cabbage recipe on the stove for about 45 minutes, and what I've done is I've been cooking it at medium heat, and occasionally what I've done is I've stirred the cabbage and the tomatoes and onions just to make sure that everything is cooking well. And then around probably when the recipe was almost ready, about 7 minutes before the recipe was ready, I already had prepared some vegetable shortening and flour paste. So what I did was I melted some vegetable shortening in a frying pan at minimum temperature, and then I added the flour, and then I continually stirred the flour until the melted vegetable shortening was mixed with the flour, and then I brought the temperature up slowly and gradually, and I continually stirred the flour and vegetable shortening mixture, and then I browned the flour. So you have to be really careful. You have to continually stir it, and you have to stir it quickly, and then you kind of bring the temperature up and down, so you kind of bring it to minimum, and then you wait for the flour to kind of sort of start bubbling and the vegetable shortening to sort of start boiling. Bring it to a boil, and then bring it down to a very low minimum heat, and then turn off the stove, and then immediately take it off the burner, and then let it just sit there. And then what I would do is I would add that paste into the tomato cabbage, and then I would stir it in very well, and then I'd bring the tomato cabbage up to a quick boil. And what that does is that it thickens the sauce. So it's an excellent way of getting sort of a thick sauce for this recipe. So like I said, this was can be served with meats. It can be served by itself. So what I'd like to do is show you the finished recipe. It is smelling great. You can smell the cabbage, the tomatoes, the onions, the garlic. So the kitchen is smelling just fantastic right now. So I'm just going to bring down the camera, and I'm going to show you this. And this is great. You can put it into, as I mentioned, you can put it into freezer containers. And I've made a really large batch of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to freeze this down, and then I'm going to add it to different ways like rice and pasta. You can mix the rice together with this recipe, or you can serve it on the side depending on your preference. You can actually add beef to this recipe. My beef stew recipe is on site, so you can serve it with that. You can serve it with mashed potatoes to the side, like mashed potatoes, and you can serve this to it, or you can serve it by itself. So I hope that you enjoy serving this recipe to your family and your friends. And if you want to get a hold of me, you can contact me at irene@irinkaskitchen.com or irinkaskitchen.com. Until next time, bon appetit, jo eet vaajat.